We are really grateful for our guest speaker, John Gustav-Wrathall, to come here, to leave Minneapolis and come to California in February to make that sacrifice. They have been having record-breaking warm weather. It's been up to 40. And so John was reluctant to leave. But we appreciate that he's come here. And we were looking for somebody who could introduce him. And we've been lucky enough to have his brother come up from Riverside, Mark Wrathall, to introduce John, our speaker.
Thank you. It was a remarkable coincidence that I was here. I was up for an academic conference at Berkeley this weekend and checking Facebook and found my brother posting pictures of himself in Oakland. So I messaged him and said, "Where are you?" And it turned out we were just a few miles apart at that point, so he invited me to come down and offered me the great privilege of introducing him. A good introduction should do two things. It should embarrass the speaker, and it should establish his or her credentials as a speaker. I'll try to do a little bit of both. So first of all, unimportant credentials. He is the president of Affirmation. Now let me give you some of the important credentials that he has. I asked him what he would like me to say by way of introducing him, and he said, "Well, introduce me as a brother," and that throws the door wide open. Let me tell you what kind of a brother John was. In the 60s, he was an enchanting brother. We're 16 months apart. He's older. He made my life a fairy tale. He was Little Red Riding Hood. How good is that? Made me be the wolf. But then we switched. He was always Batman and forced me to be Robin, which I didn't enjoy. But he was just a wonderful brother in the 60s. In the 70s and 80s, he became a nightmare of a brother because he was perfect at everything, perfect grades. He would get up before early morning seminary early to study the scriptures. All of my leaders wondered why I couldn't be like my brother was, in obeying every commandment with absolute fidelity and exactness and honor. It was a relief when he finally left home and went on a mission, and then set the standard as a missionary that, of course, I could never live up to either. In the 90s, after he came out, at first he was a very angry brother, and sorry, I don't want to cry. And an infuriating brother, and we had some very difficult times and fought, and I said things to him that I'm ashamed of, and things got very difficult. And then in the late 2005, he became the brother that he actually was all along. A brother that set an example for me of what a disciple of Christ is like. He became a brother, once again, of great faith, far greater faith than I have in returning to the church, and humbling himself and asking for forgiveness when it was me who needed to ask forgiveness of him. And he's been a loving brother and friend and uncle to my children, and still a little bit infuriated because as I travel the world with some moderate success in my career, I introduce myself in wards all over the world, in Moscow and London, for example. And the first question people always ask is, are you John Gustav-Wrathall? Any relation to John Gustav-Wrathall? So I'm very proud to introduce a magnificent brother to speak to you today, John Gustav-Wrathall.
I'm already an emotional wreck now. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I've been blessed in my family, and boy, it was a great moment in my life when Mark and I were finally able to reconcile, and it's wonderful to have him as a friend again. We were great friends, I think, and as children. You forgot about Mr. Bear and Mr. Rabbit.
No, I didn't.
I want to thank the organizers of the Fireside for bringing me here to LGBT Mormon Zion. The past year there's been one word that has been on the lips of the entire leadership of Affirmation, and that's been trauma. The last year and some months since the policy has been very difficult, and we have wrestled with how do we bring ministry and healing to a population that is really hurting right now. And boy, it felt good to come here and see the kind of support community that you're building here. And I'm just incredibly grateful for what you're doing here. And it doesn't necessarily make it easier in some ways, but it's so important for LGBT Mormons to know that they're not alone. So I want to thank you for the incredible work you're doing here. It's an example to other parts of the church, and I'm going to bring the feelings and the connections that I've made here with me back home and back to Affirmation. I'm very grateful. So because this isn't Affirmation, I feel free to share some personal reflections, and I hope this is helpful. I want to preface it too by saying that talking about and sharing at a deep level, at a personal level about being gay or lesbian or bi or transgender and Mormon, it can get pretty intense. Like, if you're going to be real, it can get pretty intense. And I've had the experience of people who are in the audience, sometimes it getting too intense. And I want you to know if you need to get up and go somewhere else, that it's okay to do that. We need to take care of ourselves. And I had somebody come up to me, it got kind of intense, and he needed to leave. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, he apologized, and he said, you're doing a great job. It's not that there's anything you're doing that's wrong, but it's hard. So I want to begin in that spirit and let you know that whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, it's okay. And if somebody needs to leave, I'd love to see somebody else get up and be with them. That's okay too. So I thought about, so I want to share this, read the scripture from Matthew chapter 15. Then Jesus went thence and departed into the coasts of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came out of the same coasts, and cried unto him, saying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, thou Son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with a devil. But he answered her not a word. And his disciples came and besought him, saying, Send her away, for she crieth after us. But he answered and said, I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Then she came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. But he answered and said, It is not meet to take the children's bread and to cast it to dogs. And she said, Truth, Lord, yet the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table. And Jesus answered and said unto her, O woman, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee even as thou wilt. And her daughter was made whole from that very hour. Now this story is told twice in the Gospels, once in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 7 and once in Matthew chapter 15. And this story of, it's the Canaanite woman in Matthew, the Syrophoenician woman in Mark, is unique in the Gospels in that it's the only story where Jesus refuses to bless someone, at least initially. And it's easy to focus on the end of the story in which Jesus miraculously heals the woman's daughter long distance, and we're inclined to interpret his initial refusal to bless as a test of the woman's faith. Except that Jesus' refusal is coupled with what, on the face of it, looks like blatant racial or ethnic discrimination and insults. That's what it looks like to me when I read that text. It is not meet, says Jesus in response to the woman's pleas for a blessing, to take the children's bread and to cast it to the dogs. Now, I've seen some exegetes try to soften the blow of the insult of comparing this woman to a dog by suggesting that the original Greek in the text was diminutive, that it didn't have the same harsh connotations that referring to someone as a dog in Middle Eastern culture typically has. Maybe consider it through the eyes of the Canaanite woman. Her daughter is suffering, and she was being refused in language that literally dehumanized both her and her daughter. In the Matthew version of the story, she followed them, crying after them from a distance, and Jesus refused to answer her. And when the disciples begged Jesus to relent, just to make her stop, he replied tersely, I'm not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That phrase, not present in the Mark version of the story, was the key to James E. Talmage's interpretation of the story. Jesus was not called by the Father to minister to the Gentiles. The keys to that work were not to be delegated until after Christ's ascension. The story could credibly have ended with that rejection, right? Jesus says, no, I'm not going to bless her, and then she leaves and gives up and says, okay. Most women in her shoes might have given up and might have left after being insulted in that way. This would not have been much of a story, however, if that had been the end of it. And it makes me wonder, it occurs to me that in the course of his ministry, Jesus might have said no to Gentiles seeking blessings many times, so often that it wouldn't have seemed worth mentioning. And this story might only have been told because of its exceptional quality, because it was a case of a Gentile who refused to take no for an answer, and whose faith was such that the blessing could not ultimately be withheld. It's reminiscent of another story recounted in Luke chapter 7, in which a Roman centurion beseeched the Jewish elders to intercede for him on behalf of a dying servant. Perhaps the centurion knew that Jesus was not sent but unto the house of Israel, which would explain why he never appeared in person to Jesus Christ, and why he sent Jewish messengers to convey the message, I am not worthy that thou shouldst enter under my roof, neither thought I myself worthy to come unto thee, but say in a word, and my servant shall be healed. Jesus marveled at the man's faith and proclaimed, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. The Luke account does not specify whether the servant was of the house of Israel or not, but it does state that, like the daughter of the Canaanite woman, the servant was healed thanks to the exceptional faith of a Gentile. So to return to the story of the Canaanite woman, her faith was such that she did not allow herself to be put off, neither by the insistent rejections nor by the dehumanizing language. Yes, Lord, was her response to the dog's comment. Yet the dogs under the table eat of the children's crumbs. It was when she said that Christ knew there was no blessing he could withhold from her. O woman, replied Jesus, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee even as thou wilt. As a gay man who am excommunicated and who am unable to be reinstated into membership in the church because of my 25 years relationship with my husband, and who have a testimony of the gospel, and who am active in my LDS ward, I've occasionally been accused of accepting crumbs. I've been told that a self-respecting person does not do that. A self-respecting person demands a full place at the table and accepts nothing less. Now, I don't believe for a single moment that Canaanite woman believed that either she or her daughter were of less value in the eyes of God than any child of the house of Israel. The proof of that was in her unwillingness to relinquish a blessing she knew her daughter needed. Her perseverance until she had secured that blessing, her willingness to humble herself before God in order to claim that blessing. In a sense, by turning Christ's refusal away with the words, yes, Lord, yet the dogs eat the crumbs, she affirmed her infinite worth in terms that Christ could not deny. Great is thy faith, he said, of her. Or, I've not found so great faith in Israel, as he said of the Roman centurion. To my way of thinking, it would have been her turning away, her giving up, that might have devalued her. To turn away might have been an admission that she or her daughter were less worthy of the blessing than anybody else Christ might have healed more readily. I am of infinite worth, and so is my husband. And so I show up at church, and I live the gospel as fully as I'm permitted within the current confines. My presence at church is simultaneously two things. It's a testimony of the truthfulness of the gospel, which is a bedrock of my life, and it's a testimony of my infinite worth. That begs the question, why does the church treat people in a discriminatory manner? Or to put it in slightly harder terms, how could a church that discriminates against people, that is seemingly a respecter of persons, be true? As I was writing this talk, I was exchanging messages with a faithful lesbian mom who has been distraught because her daughter just turned 8 years old and will not be able to be baptized as her older siblings were. We can take the experience of LGBT people today and we can put it in the context of long millennia of discrimination of some sort in the church, whether it's for race or gender or ability. God is no respecter of persons. if the story of the Canaanite woman is an illustration of anything, it's of this fundamental truth. God does not discriminate, but apparently God's church is a respecter of persons. The story of the Canaanite woman is also an illustration of that reality. Even Christ himself seemed somewhat bound or limited by that reality. The Gospels and the Book of Mormon's witness of Jesus Christ almost always shows Christ standing with the disadvantaged. It shows us that when the society or the church marginalize people, God stands with the marginalized. That's the overwhelming witness of the Gospels and of Scripture. That is the normal ethic that God demands of us. But if we believe, and I believe it, that Christ was God incarnate, then the incarnate aspect of him being placed in a temporal, worldly context and in a framework of all the limitations that came with that context meant that he could transcend that at times, but he couldn't just dispense with it. He couldn't just make it go away. And if Christ couldn't just make it go away, then I'm not sure how I would expect his apostles to, especially when the scriptures are replete with examples of Christ's apostles' limitations. It doesn't make the gospel or the church any less true. We can theorize or we can speculate about why the limitations exist. Perhaps it's God accommodating human weakness. Perhaps when human beings learn to stop putting artificial limitations on someone because of their race or their gender or their sexuality or their gender identity or their ability, then God eagerly takes us as a church, as a people, to the next step of evolution as a human family. Maybe we're just not ready to accept everybody equally. And when we are, God's happy to take us there. There is a fundamental gospel principle that we're able to see God only to the extent that we become like him. And the becoming part is the real challenge. So maybe it's just this stuff in our own hearts that we have to overcome. And when we do that, those policies, those things that exist in the church that put walls between people, those fall down. Why? Because those walls can't stand if we don't hold on to them in our hearts. Perhaps God has some master scheme in mind that requires steps. Perhaps God, for instance, could only have overcome the innate human tendency toward idolatry by creating a chosen people, unnecessarily limiting or a discriminatory act, right? If you say this people are chosen, then that means all these other people are not chosen. There's scriptural support for the notion that God used the law to discipline his chosen peoples because of our innate tendency towards selfishness and egotism. Though the arc of the history of God's engagement with humanity shows him weaning us toward a higher law of selflessness and compassion, free of the legalism and the harsh discipline of the past. So maybe we just need that whip of the law to get us over our selfishness, and then when we're ready, then we can move into that higher law. So nothing for me about the existence of these limitations or of the trauma that they create for so many convinces me that God is absent or non-existent. Amidst the pain, God is at work. And I've had too many experiences that are unexplainable to me in any other way than that his hand has been in my life and that the restored priesthood is real. And I've had too many experiences to not believe that God lives and that he's guiding the church. I'm also convinced that God takes the principle of agency very seriously. It's the foundational principle of creation. And that principle of agency has been the source of incredible pain and suffering and misery in the history of the human family. But it is also the source of some of the crowning joy that is available to us in this life, that principle of agency. So, all that having been said, whatever the reasons for legalism and discrimination in our institutional religious framework, it doesn't change the fact we can know it in our heads, we can say this is why it exists. It doesn't change the fact that to be gay or lesbian or bi or transgender in this world today demands an extraordinary kind of faith. And that's why I want to directly and personally address the last half of my remarks to my fellow lesbian, gay, bi, and transgender siblings here in the audience today. There's a significant difference between us and the Canaanite woman in Matthew chapter 15. The Canaanite woman had her daughter, and her daughter had her, and they had the love of family. And if there were ethnic divisions between Jews and non-Jews in Palestine at that time, non-Jews had their family structure, they had their social institutions, and they could find love and acceptance within that. And far, far too often, many LGBT people have lost our families. And that's the number one source of trauma that I see in my work in affirmation, is rejection from our families. And LGBT people are sometimes blessed to have our families come on this journey with us, but we've never been able to take it for granted. Talk to any LGBT person and ask them about the moment that they decided to come out to family, and ask them what that felt like. And I have just seen the absolute devastation and the trauma that happens when we experience that rejection. But here's what I can say about the rejection we've experienced. Every significant thing that was told to me in the church about what it would mean to be gay has turned out to be completely false. I was told that gay people were incapable of real love, that we were incapable of forming lasting commitments, and this year my husband and I are celebrating our 25th anniversary. And the one thing I can say about the love between us is that it has never been deeper or stronger or more nourishing than it is now. And that love between me and my husband has steadily grown day by day, month by month, year by year, through trials and challenges and heartache, and through mistakes and failings and forgiveness, and through the raising and care of foster children. And if our love is not real, then I can't imagine what real love is, because what we have surpasses my ability to express it in its power to heal and to teach and to inspire, and in its infinite potential. The one thing I know about this journey I'm on with my husband, you're on, is that I can see an ascent that goes on beyond the horizon of what I can see. It has infinite potential. I was told that if I entered into a same-sex relationship of any sort, that I would lose the Spirit of God. But I have the Spirit in my life, and so does my husband. How do you know when the Spirit is present in someone's life? When you see the fruit of the Spirit. Love, hope, patience, faith, kindness, forgiveness, perseverance. And do I know gay people in same-sex relationships who manifest the fruit of the Spirit and who have gifts of the Spirit? Oh, I do. In abundance. And if we seek God in patience and humility, He pours out His Spirit on us. That's what I've learned. As long as I believed that lie and I was afraid to go to God directly and ask for help, I was in darkness. But the moment I turned to God and said, please help me, right here where I am, that's when God poured His Spirit out on me. So can we have the Spirit? Yeah, we can. And so one thing that I can say about the church's current policy related to gay people is that if these things that I had been told were true, if real commitment and love were impossible in a same-sex relationship, if a same-sex relationship denied us the possibility of having the Spirit in our lives and having a relationship with God, if those things were true, then the policy would be wise and kind, because it would be designed to prevent us from harming ourselves. It would be designed to protect us from falling into lonely lives devoid of spirituality or meaning. And I think that's what our leaders believe they're protecting us from. I'm the president of Affirmation, so I feel like I'd be remiss in my duty if I didn't leave you with some affirmations. Affirmation number 1. We are greater than the rejection. When people are unkind to us, when they reject us, there's a fundamental spiritual principle that we need to be aware of. What you do to others, you only do to yourself. We are all interconnected, and we're all connected to God. And that's why Christ said, if you do it unto one of the least of these, you have done it unto me. When people reject us, we might think it's some kind of reflection on our worth, but it's not. A person who rejects you may be revealing something unfortunate and unpleasant about themselves, but in their rejection, there is not the least of an iota of reflection on who you are or what you are worth. We are greater than the rejection. Affirmation number 2. God does not reject us. I believe the founding scripture of Mormonism is James chapter 1, verse 5. Read it. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all liberally, and upbraideth not. It says, if any of you lack wisdom. That means the only prerequisite is that we lack wisdom, which most of us do, and I can speak for myself and say I do. And it says, God giveth to all. There are no disclaimers here, no exceptions, no requirements that you be straight or righteous or anything at all. It says all, and it says, and upbraideth not, which means that God does not scold us or punish us for asking him the wrong question. That's not how God operates. He doesn't care what you have to ask. He doesn't upbraid you for that. He cares only that you ask him and that you turn to him. And it says liberally, which means when we ask God for something, he is not stingy. God does not hold back. He pours out blessings on us. And I know this scripture is true because I've tested it and I have found it truer than I've ever been able to imagine. God does not reject us. And affirmation number 3 is that my dear LGBT brothers and sisters, we are in a better position to understand the gospel than many of our straight brothers and sisters. Why? Why is that? Because we have to work and we have to struggle and we have to fight for every ounce of understanding about ourselves. Because we're not permitted to take anything for granted. Because we have to build a relationship with God that's refined through trial and error. Because we learn the heart of the gospel by forgiving. And right now, if you are LGBT and Mormon, you don't have to look very far to find plenty of opportunities to forgive. Forgiving does not diminish us. Forgiveness is one of the greatest, most humanizing gifts of the atonement. It's the most powerful way we can realize for ourselves that first affirmation I shared with you, that we are greater than the rejection. It enables us to access the forgiveness we need for our mistakes and our shortcomings, and it unlocks the power of love and redemption. The gospel applies to us every bit as much as it applies to every other child of God on the planet. But when we're marginal, when we have experienced rejection and loneliness, when we have had to sit in the dark without friends or guides, then we are in a position to acquire deep understanding. So, my brothers and sisters, we are in a good position to understand the gospel. We're in a much better position than most of us think. We have gifts that the church needs, without which the church cannot prosper. And, you know, I have a friend, he's a gay Jewish Buddhist friend of mine. And, you know, he and I have had some really sort of heart-to-heart talks, and he sometimes has struggled with why I am so committed to the church and why this is so important to me. And I tried to explain it to him the other day, and I said, I have this vision of Mount Zion, of the Lord's holy temple, and I had a dream about the temple. And we were all in there dancing together. Just like the saints danced in the Nauvoo temple before they were driven out. And in my vision, I see in the temple gay, lesbian, straight, bi, transgender, non-binary, people of every race and tribe and background, and women and men. And there will be no poor among us. Poor means we'll all have the same blessings. No poor means we'll all have the same blessings. There will be no marginal people. There will be no people on the edges. And I will see all of you there with my husband and our foster sons and my parents and my brother and all my siblings and my nephews and my nieces and my uncles and aunts and cousins and our ancestors and our descendants. And the Spirit will be poured out on all of us with a richness and a power that none of us imagined possible. None of us imagined. It will be a richness and a power of the Spirit that our straight brothers and sisters had never realized was possible, because until that moment, we had been missing from the equation. So, here, as I've been staying here in Oakland, I've been staying with Judy Finch. And Judy has been one of the most constant supports to me through this past year, which has been one of the most challenging times in my life. And one of the things that Judy keeps reminding me is that the most important thing I can do for anybody else is to take care of myself and to do whatever I need to be healthy and happy and whole. I can't help anybody else if I don't do that. And so the last thing that I want to say to my LGBT brothers and sisters in the room is I want to pass Judy's advice on to you. I love you deeply. And every morning I wake up to thoughts of my LGBT brothers and sisters throughout the world, and I pray and work throughout the day as I work with affirmation and thinking about what I can do that will bring people hope and encouragement. And I've seen so much trauma, and I've felt the pain that so many people have felt, and I've been amazed by your capacity to transcend that and to heal. But I say, take care of yourselves and do whatever you need to do to be happy and healthy and whole. And you don't need to go any place where you're not affirmed in the fullness and integrity of who you are. All of you, every molecule of you. You don't need to go to church to find that. And you need to go where you can find that. And if you've begun to catch a vision of yourself as whole and good and complete and as a divine child of God, if you have found that healing and you are able to stand on that ground and find that spiritual center, then there is work for you to do. There is much healing needed in the world. And I invite you to join in that work. In the name of Jesus Christ, our teacher, our Savior, and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. So, Jeff and John asked if I'd be willing to answer questions or continue a discussion. Yeah, Barb.
For some people who don't know what affirmation is, can you tell us about affirmation and all the work that you've been doing worldwide?
Yeah, thank you, Barb. So affirmation has...
Repeat the question.
Barb asked me to explain what is affirmation, tell a little bit more about affirmation, what it is. So affirmation began in the late 1970s, in 1977, 1978. It initially began as there were some groups that were kind of meeting underground at BYU. They had to use pseudonyms, like your affirmation name was your middle name and your mother's maiden name. So like my name would have been like Donald Kalinen, right? And they had secret names because, you could get excommunicated, you could get kicked out of campus, right? And they began to gather, and they began with a vision or a belief, the conviction that if God made us, then there has to be a place for us in the gospel. Like that was their starting point. And they didn't necessarily know like what the trail was to, that led to all the answers to how that works out. But they began with that idea, and they began to form groups. There was a group that formed in LA, there was a group that formed in Washington, D.C., there was a group that formed in Denver, Colorado. And and so the work of affirmation has always been and continues to be today. There are two major things that we try to do. One is to provide a healing, loving community of support for LGBT Mormons. Regardless of where you are, you've left the church, you're in the church, it doesn't matter. We recognize the trauma, the pain, and the need for healing. And so that's the first thing. It's about providing a healing community. And the second is to promote dialogue within the church about this issue, to promote greater understanding. So those are the two things that we're about. And affirmation has grown tremendously within the last few years. And right now, within the last 3 years, there's been a tremendous growth, particularly in Latin America. We have chapters of affirmation now in Mexico, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Colombia. This year we're going to be doing our first ever conference in Dominican Republic. We have a chapter in Europe that we're working on and that's growing rapidly. We're going to have 4 conferences in the UK this year. We're going to have an international conference in London. Just before this Fireside, I was doing an online spiritual gathering that's sponsored by Affirmation once a month, and we had this was the first online spiritual gathering that we had where we had simultaneous translation in Portuguese and Spanish, and we had the Latin American participation in the online gathering outnumbered the U.S. participation like something like 2 to 1. So it's been growing, and everywhere we're trying to operate on those principles of providing a community of support and creating dialogue. And it's been amazing to me to see what happens when people have reached out to leaders of the church and to members of the church, and we've seen some great things happen as a result of that. And it's been amazing to me to see how healing that community has been for individuals, particularly within the last year. And our conference in Provo last year was really a beautiful, very healing experience. And we're going to be doing our annual international conference, sort of the big one where everybody comes from all over the world if they can, in Provo again in September. So we're on affirmation.org, so if you don't know about affirmation, feel free to check out the website. And yeah, so thanks for asking, Barb. Yeah.
So your husband, not a member of the church or never was, and does he go to church with you? Like, what are his thoughts on the church?
Yeah, he'd have a word or two to say. And he doesn't, if you know my husband, you know he doesn't hold back. And no, he's never been a member of the church, and he likes to tell people that when he was growing up, his parents were kind of seekers, and they tried a little bit of everything. So, you know, they went to the Catholic Church, they burned incense and were Buddhists, and they did the Jehovah's Witness thing and Pentecostal, and they kind of did everything but Mormonism. And so I came into his life to kind of fill the void, I guess. My re-engagement with the church initially was a challenge for him. He was a little bit worried about what that might lead to, and it was difficult. It was a challenge for him, and he still he actually reads all the posts on Facebook by LGBT Mormons and allies, and every time there's some new outrage, he comes to me and he's like, "Look what your church is doing," and I'm like, "I know, I read it this morning." He does come to me with church. He comes to church with me, and he's great, and he's supportive, and he does these sweet things. I was asked to speak at the Kirtland Temple at an affirmation conference, and we had a devotional in the Kirtland Temple, and I got to speak from the the rostrum where Joseph Smith used to preach. Right, it was like this kind of head trip, right? And he knew how special that was. Like, there were affirmation members there who were kind of like weeping as we were doing the tour of the grounds, and we were kind of talking about the experiences that the saints had there. And so he went around the grounds of the Kirtland Temple, and he picked up little leaves off the ground, and then he took them home and he put them in a little frame, a picture frame, and he gave it to me as kind of a souvenir of Kirtland. And he does come to church with me, and my current bishop is like really super awesome, and my bishop, shortly after he became bishop, I met with him, and he said, "I hope you don't mind, but I told the Ward Council that I have it as a goal to have your husband attend church more often." And so I told the Ward Council that they need to be on the watch for him, and if anybody does anything to make him feel at all unwelcome, you are going to deal with them and make sure that doesn't happen. And he's been over to our home for dinner, and Euron fell in love with his wife. You know, he like took her on a tour of the garden, and like they swapped, you know, gardening tips, and he thinks she should be the bishop. You know, so anyway, yeah. He's supportive, and the number one way that he supports me a lot of the times is to have patience when I have to leave town, and that's a trial for both of us. So.
So has this affirmation journey been what you expected?
No. Well, for one thing, when I put my hat into the ring to run for president of Affirmation, that it was August of 2015, and the policy came out literally the day before the election was supposed to start. And it was so bad. I mean, the turmoil online was so terrible that the Affirmation Board of Directors decided to delay the election because they were like, we just can't deal with this right now. And my first thought was, what the heck? Like, my first thought was, I'm going to lose the election because I've always been so close to the church, and one of the big challenges as president of Affirmation has been that, like I said, we have to be a community that ministers to everybody, and so a lot of times I've had to kind of pull back, and we work really hard to create space for everybody, but I thought, how are we going to deal with all of the pain that this is causing, and it created challenges within the leadership, and it's been quite a ride, but I'm seeing beautiful things come out of it, and people are now finally, like, now that we're over a year past that, I think people are kind of recovering from the shock a little bit, and they've made their peace in various ways. So, like, before the policy, we did a survey. Affirmation did a survey last October, and it was a long survey, and we asked a whole bunch of questions, and we had over 1,000 people who completely filled the entire survey out. And we had participants from all over North America, South America, and about half of the people who responded to the survey had been active in the church prior to the policy. And that was pretty much what I had observed in Affirmation. Probably about half of our membership at that point were active in the church. And after the policy, that dropped to about 1 in 5 Affirmation members were still active in the church after the policy. And so a lot of people just kind of made their peace with it by leaving and saying, we're done. And other people have kind of, made their peace with it by saying, I'll be damned if I'm going to leave. you're going to have to like kick me out. And some of us, like, me, don't get the message even when you excommunicate us. So, so that's, so people are kind of, they're sort of adjusting to that new reality. And like I said, I've seen just some beautiful growth, and spiritual growth. Because what's the heart of the gospel? It's love, and this has given us an amazing opportunity to learn how to love each other better. So, yeah.
I wonder if you could tell us about what drew you back to the church. There's a really long answer to that question, which I was sharing with Jeff and Catherine before. That took like 40 minutes to tell, but the short version is that after 19 years away from the church, I had a very compelling spiritual experience that happened when I was on a visit to Utah in August of 2005, and I felt the Spirit prompting me to come back, and I fought with that and wrestled with it, and I was deeply unhappy that God would ask me to do something like that, and I wasn't, I was like, can this really be God telling me to do this, or is this just some tape in my head? But it was like this, it was a profound thing, and I, so I started to attend church after some wrestling internally about a couple of months later. And it's been an amazing journey for me, and it's been an amazing journey within my ward and with my ward family, and as I've been able to be out and to grow with members of my ward over the past 12 years, we've just been, what I've told my bishop very truthfully is that my ward is my sanctuary. It's the place where I feel safest, and it's the place where I feel most whole. And I say that knowing full well that there's so many LGBT Mormons who it's the opposite. Like it's not safe. It's not where you experience wholeness. But for me, it has been, and it's been partly because of this experience of growth with members of my ward over time, and I feel like it's the one place where I can be every bit of who I am, where I can be gay and Mormon, like fully. Like there's all kinds of places where I can be gay but not so Mormon, and there are places where I can be Mormon and not so gay, but my ward fortunately is not one of those. And like we had last Sunday, I was in church and we had a high councilman come and speak, and bless his heart, he said some pretty clueless things, and I immediately had like several members of my ward like reach out to me like on Facebook, or they called me and they were like, are you okay? Like, I was like, oh yeah, I'm used to this. Are you okay? So yeah. But yeah.
Can I say something about that? Because you left out a big part of the story that you don't know about. You've heard this once now, but part of the answer to that question is we have a mom who was a woman of incredible faith, and she never stopped praying and fasting that he would come back to the church, and she would call me and tell me to pray and to fast that he would come back to the church, and I would say, Mom, John is gay, and he's not going to come back to the church, and she never quit. And she didn't know how, but she knew he would be back.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And my parents, my parents were fully accepting of me out of the church. Like it was there was like a period of struggle where they kind of, and then there came a point where they were like, my mom actually, you know, my blessed sweet mother who was praying for me to come back to the church, but she, you know, I remember her saying to me, like when I did come back, she was like, it's so good that there's nothing more they can do to you. You know, you've already been excommunicated, they can't do anything more to you. And, you know, she knew that during the time that I was away from the church, I needed that time to grow and heal and be safe. And so she was, you know, she was unconditionally loving regardless of where I was. But that was another place where, you know, was in our home. Because I can't pray in church, but I can pray in our home. Like when I'm with my parents and with my siblings, Dad calls on me to say family prayers, and so in the church of the home, I'm a full member in good standing, and the Spirit was there, you know, is there and with us in our home. And I love visiting my dad. I love praying with my dad. And so I knew, like, if that can work, then it can work in the church too. Like if my dad knows that, and if my mom knew that, then the folks up in the red chairs in Salt Lake can figure that out too eventually.
We'll have one more question.
Okay, sorry. Like I kind of get this reaction a lot when you introduce yourself as a gay Mormon. Like you get kind of the same feeling as when you hear about like Jews for Jesus. Like as far as like conceptually invalidates not only your religious identity but your religious opinion. And so like how do you deal with people that like hear that like, okay, well you identify as Mormon but you're not really a Mormon because you're now invalidated.
You know, I've had that question asked of me, and like weirdly, I've heard that question more often from liberal Mormons than from conservative Mormons. I don't know what that's about, but I think I think the proof is in the pudding, and you know, Mormonism is, being a Mormon, I guess, is kind of like recognizing great art. You know it when you see it, and so I don't know. I don't get that question asked of me a lot. I guess people figure I've paid my dues to be considered a Mormon. Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for the spirit that I felt here, and I guess I'll let
Thank you,
close
John.
it up. So